Cross-cultural management, managing people across cultures, the role of culture in the workplace. Strangely, preparing this lecture was the biggest challenge for me in this course. I have been studying culture and cultural effects in the workplace for the past 20 years. I have published dozens and dozens of papers on the topic. I have written specifically dedicated books, book chapters, delivered several courses that deal exclusively with cross-cultural management. And so I found myself in a situation where I had a hard time condensing all of that to a 1-hour lecture. So I'll try to give you some of the basics, sort of an introduction to cross-cultural management, some of the most important and sort of bird-eye view overview of the topic. But yes, one can literally have not a whole book on the topic, not a whole course on the topic, but an entire academic career on the topic. And so my challenge here is not what to say, but what not to say. So what should I pick from the wealth of information we have accumulated over the decades of studying the topic, and so what should be presented in this single lecture on the topic? So I will start with sort of reminiscing here about the time when I had to deliver a presentation on this topic for the first time, probably about 20 years ago, back in Canada, a little bit more maybe. So at that time, I was invited to talk to an organization that caters to immigrants. And so they were asking me to talk a little bit about culture. And since it was my first time to deliver a lecture on the topic, I went to my file drawers and started looking for papers that have shown that culture matters. So basically that have studied empirically the effects of culture in the workplace. So 20 years ago, at that time, in my literal file drawers with papers, paper papers, not electronic papers, I found at that time 67 papers that showed that culture does matter. So that looked at the effects of culture in the international workplace. And so you don't need to look at the specific numbers here. The point is that even at that time, there were a lot of studies that empirically provided empirical evidence that culture does indeed affect how we, for example, perceive what is fair and what is not, what is just and what is not, how we, our preferences for different leadership styles, or how we lead as leaders, preferences to work in teams and how that work should be structured, our negotiation styles, our job satisfaction, all kinds of other areas that are affected by culture. And again, later on, I've done my own research in this area. I even published a few meta-analytic papers that sort of summarize all of the empirical evidence. And now I can say that, yes, culture explains a lot. It does not explain everything. It's not, a magic pill or a silver bullet that explains everything that is going on in the workplace. But it does matter, and we have a lot of evidence to that effect. Now, when I teach this course in face-to-face format, I would start this course with a game where I offer my students to kind of play against me a few simulations or activities that illustrate how we are culturally pre-programmed. And so when I ask my students, are you culturally pre-programmed? Most of them say, well, I am not. I know other people are affected by their upbringing, by the culture in which they grew up, but I am not. And so I would show them some activities that sort of illustrate that most of us do have certain preconceptions or schemas in our head that do affect how we see things, how we understand things, how we interpret things, things we prefer, things we do or ways we do things. And so here are some of those illustrations. So for example, if I showed you this map and asked you, what is wrong with it? What would you say? Obviously to you, probably if you are from the United States or from Europe or from Asia for that matter, this map looks upside down. The truth is, it's not really upside down. It's just an Australian representation of the world. It didn't really catch on dramatically. I mean, it did appear in a few textbooks. Here is another rendering of this map. Yes, there is really nothing wrong with this map per se. So we are just used to seeing Europe, for example, on the top of the world and Africa and Australia on the bottom of the world or world map. But strictly speaking, there is really nothing wrong with these maps from the geographic point of view. They're just inconvenient for us to work with because they're different from what we are used to, how we see the world in the textbooks that we grew up with. And so that creates inconvenience, misunderstandings, but otherwise there is really nothing wrong with it. Now, how about this map here? What is wrong with this map? Again, there is really nothing wrong with it. This is a real snapshot from a website, LG's website. And this is what the map looks like in the textbooks in Asia, for example. It makes perfect sense. So this map places Asia at the center of the map, and it allows you to better see how you relate to the rest of the world. Now, so that's exactly how the map appears in Asian textbooks commonly, and you can find many other websites of Asian companies that render the map this way. But for those of us from Europe or North America, or Latin America for that matter, we will find this map wrong or inconvenient to work with. We would be looking for New York somewhere in China and things like that. So obviously it's inconvenient. And if people sort of come to the table with these different maps or schematas, so they will probably have a different, or there will be a slowdown in their communication and collaboration. How about this one here? So can you read this message? Again, obviously you can, but it does take you a little mental effort to interpret this message, even though in theory there could be civilizations out there that read and write this way. But to us, it will look, if not completely wrong, then inconvenient, right? Hard to work with. Here is another activity or a series of activities that I show to my students. I'll just give you one example of how I show them or test whether or not, or show them how you can relatively quickly sort of pre-program what people see on the map, on the picture. And so the way it would go is like this. I would split the classroom into two groups, A and B, and I would ask both groups to close their eyes, and then I would ask one group only to open their eyes, and I would show them this. And I would let them a few minutes to look at this picture, making sure that they know what they're paying attention to. Most of you by now have probably seen this picture, and you know that there are two faces on this picture, not just one. And so I have several versions of this activity with more recent renderings that people are not familiar with. But so one group sees this picture, and then the other group sees this picture. And then I would show them the picture without the oval or markings, and I would ask them, so what do you see? And so some people see only the face of a young girl, and some see only the face of an older woman. And so what's interesting that those people who see only the old face or the young face are the people who were programmed into seeing only one face or the other. So those in group A whose attention was drawn to the face of a young lady, so here with the eye and the nose and the chin and the ear, they keep seeing only the young girl's face. And the other way around, those whose attention was drawn to see the face of the old lady keep seeing only the face of the old lady. And so then I would say, well, see, it took me only a few seconds to program in a way in your mind what you see on the picture. Now imagine that I have 20 years of your life to sort of indoctrinate you into ways of thinking, of seeing things, how much stronger that effect would be. And so, as I said, I do have several other renderings of the same game with more recent, less familiar pictures. And so people are like, wow, this is cool. And so, yes, often you would see, there are always some people who sort of are familiar with this illusion. And so they would see both, or at least know that there must be both faces there, or both whatever other, like in one of them, it's a dancing woman. So, spinning clockwise or counterclockwise. But there are always at least 50, 60% of the people who see only one, and only what I sort of pre-programmed them to see. Very strong effect. And again, culture kind of works that way. Now, let me go back to some of the basics before we get into some of the more fun stuff. So one of the papers I published some years ago was a meta-analysis of published research on the effects of culture up until that date. So it was basically a total of about 575 papers, empirical papers, academic papers, that looked at the effects of culture on all kinds of outcomes. And so the paper was published in 2009, so it's publications up until then. And so by summarizing all of that evidence from hundreds and hundreds of publications, we found, or we reported, that overall culture does correlate with organizational attitudes and behaviors. The correlations are moderate, so they're not extremely strong, but they are strong enough, and they are strongest for predicting work-related emotions. A little bit weaker predictive power when it comes to attitudes and behaviors. Not so much performance per se. So we found that just because you know what country the person is from will not tell you how hard the person will work, how well the person will perform. But it does tell you under which conditions the person will perform better, or what management system will work better for this person. The effect was much stronger at the country level. So if you have a group of people, it may be impossible to predict what each individual will do. But we can pretty well predict what the group on average will do, or what attitude or belief or preference will be dominant in that group. So here the correlation and the predictive power is pretty strong, in fact, quite strong. And then the effect is a little bit lower at the team level, so if you have a smaller group, and then at the individual level, yet a little bit smaller. What is interesting, and this is very, very important, so as I said, the correlations are not perfect. So culture explains a lot, but not everything. But, and this is very, very important, we compared the predictive power of culture against other indicators that are often used in research or by HR specialists or managers to predict human behavior. And we found that culture is a better predictor of work-related attitudes and behaviors than, for example, personality, or demographics. But IQ was even better predictor of your performance. So that means that, yes, culture does not explain everything, but it explains a lot, and it explains more than, for example, your personality can explain, your demographics such as age or gender can explain, and almost as much as IQ when it comes to performance. So culture matters, and it's worth studying. And so it's important to know that, yes, what works in, for example, China may not and probably will not work in, for example, the US. Here is my attempt at being funny. So here is a cartoon that shows how cowboys are trying to basically make a man walk up the plank. And so they have apparently a pirate here who is the supervisor of the gang. And so he's like, that's strange. Walking the plank works so well on the ship. So why is it not working here in Texas, I guess, wherever they are? So what works well in one country may not and possibly and probably will not work in another country. Now, before we get into all of the details, lots of research has been conducted on cross-cultural teams. And so one of the obvious questions is, as we get into this topic, do diverse teams perform better than homogeneous teams? Let me ask you that question. So if you had two teams, randomly assembled teams, or if you had a collection of teams, some of them are culturally homogeneous, everybody is from the same culture, and some of them are culturally diverse. Everybody is from a different country on the team. Which of those teams do you think will perform better? Culturally homogeneous or culturally heterogeneous, culturally diverse? Now, I actually have done quite a lot of research in this area, so let me share with you some of my own results of some of my own research and results of research from some of my colleagues. So, one, it depends on the purpose. Research shows that when the task is creative, homogeneous or culturally diverse teams tend to perform a little bit better. You have more variety of opinions, of knowledge types, connections, experiences. And so as a result, you have more ideas on the table. And as a result, you have a better solution. On the routine task, all that diversity will not be beneficial, but may slow down your communication. So cross-cultural teams may not perform as well as culturally homogeneous teams. Also, some research looked at the duration of the project and showed that when the project is short, you are sort of better off having a homogeneous team. So the people come from the same background, speak the same language, have the same values. So the adjustment period is very short and they can get right to business. Whereas when you have people from different cultures, it does take time for them to kind of get up to speed, to get adjusted to one another. And so as a result, they may not be as productive because it's a short run. Here is a snapshot of a results section from my own study that I conducted and published not long ago. And so for this study, we wanted to see how different types of diversity affect different types of team performance indicators. So we looked at every possible type of difference: cultural difference, IQ difference, demographic difference, economic difference, religion difference, and things like that. And we also looked at the outcomes. And again, we classified them into task outcomes and psychological outcomes. So the task outcomes, that's basically the quality of the output. So the task required students to produce a consulting report, a project. And so the task outcomes were essentially the quality of the decisions, the quality of the output. And the psychological outcomes were things like satisfaction with one another, the number of conflicts. So basically the process-related outcomes, how well people or how good people felt about the full thing, how happy they were with one another. And so we looked at about, I think it was something like 15 different diversity dimensions, and then about 10 or so different outcomes that were grouped into this personal background and contextual background and task outcomes and psychological outcomes. And so what we found was that your sort of national variety, so when people come from different countries, it does have a strong positive effect on the team's output quality. So the more diverse your team is, the better the decisions, the better the creativity, the solutions, problem solving. And so as a result, all that variety of perspectives and variety of knowledge allows you to produce a better quality work. But at the same time, differences, especially personal differences, such as cultural differences, value differences, demographic differences, they had a strong negative effect on psychological outcomes. So they led to communication challenges. They led to out-group prejudice. So there were some stereotypes, there were some conflicts. There was less team cohesion, less attraction to one another. And so as a result, that sort of damaged team morale to some extent and sort of the process. So in a way, this study showed us that culture is, as we talk about it, a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it could be extremely beneficial. On the other hand, it comes with a set of challenges. And so you have to sort of recognize both the pros and cons of cultural and diversity in general. Now, how is this research done? So just to give you an example of a study. So for example, we would ask the study participants to look at the picture here, and you see here a simple plastic bag, like a grocery plastic bag. And we would ask, for example, the team, give me as many ideas, as many suggestions for what can be used, for what this plastic bag can be used. And so in studies that look at the performance and effectiveness of homogeneous versus culturally diverse teams, they would have some homogeneous teams and some culturally diverse teams trying to come up with as many possible ideas for how a plastic bag can be used. And so studies show again and again that culturally diverse teams beat homogeneous teams on this task. So people coming from different cultural backgrounds with different cultural experiences, different kinds of exposures, types of knowledge, they come up with all kinds of novel or disparate, different ideas for what this plastic bag could be used for. So homogeneous teams are not as effective at this task. Again, it doesn't mean that culturally diverse teams are better. It just means that they're able to come up with more interesting solutions to a problem. And so this is just one example of a study like that. As I said, we had over 500 papers in, for example, the meta-analytic review that we've done. Since then, the number of research, published studies has probably doubled. In fact, I contributed a few dozen of those kinds of studies to this collection. But this is an example of how this research is done. Now, let me show you a short video again, my attempt at being funny here. This one is from a movie from the 90s called Mr. Baseball. And so this one is about a guy from the United States who goes to Japan he meets a girl and she invites him for dinner or lunch maybe at her place. And so the clip here from that movie illustrates sort of the cultural differences or cultural differences in cultural norms and etiquette around the table. And so it just illustrates that sometimes little things all of a sudden could be a source of tension and misunderstandings in international settings. So let's watch this video.
It's polite. It's okay. Jack?
What?
Bad luck.
ちゃんとヒロコ教えてあげなさいよ。
So obviously this is an extreme example and the guy here takes it to a little too far, but we can see how all kinds of norms around the table etiquette can be misconstrued and lead to tensions, conflicts, miscommunication. So just as an example. Now, here is my own theory why culture is a challenge, or cultural differences could be a challenge, particularly when it comes to cross-cultural communication. So why do we have a difficult time when we have to communicate with people from other cultures? Again, this is not from the textbook. This is my own theory. I think that through the course of evolution, our brains have evolved to help us interpret the world around us. And when there is not enough information, our brain in a way fills the gaps and gives us a complete picture, or at least so it does think that it gives us a more complete picture. Likewise, over time, we develop heuristics, or we develop shortcuts for what to pay attention to so we can better interpret the world. So our senses are imperfect, and so we learn how to quickly make decisions by looking at a limited sort of information stream. And most of the time, it serves us very well. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't. And so culture in this case is that sort of background, or that additional information that our brain uses to interpret the world. And so let me show you here how it may misfire, so to speak. So in a familiar world, culture does allow us, basically culture gives us this shortcut to quickly make decisions about the world. So if the world is familiar. But if the world is unfamiliar, if the situation is different, if culture is different, all of a sudden we start making mistakes when interpreting what we see. For example, look at this picture here. You may have seen it before, you may know what it means, but so the question here is, which of the two orange circles is bigger? And you probably know that the two orange circles should be the same size. But see, I changed the background here, and all of a sudden, the orange circle on the right looks bigger to you. I can prove to you that it's not bigger, so let me show you here. So I'll take a kind of circumference of the one on the left. I move it to the right, and it's precisely the same size. So sorry, I moved it a little too fast. But yes, as you can see, it's exactly the same size. But for some reason, our brain misjudges the size because of that background. So under normal conditions, we would have no difficulties interpreting the size. But you add this kind of strange background, and all of a sudden we have a hard time with it. Here is another illusion. So here you see two cells on the chessboard, A and B. And if I ask you what color they are, so you probably, as most of us would say, well, A is sort of black and B is white, or maybe A is dark gray and B is, I don't know, white or light gray. But the truth is that they are precisely the same color. So let me cut them out here and move them out here, right? So as you see, once I move them away from the sort of presumably shaded background, you see that they become exactly the same size. It's not manipulation. I literally just cut them out and move them away. But our brain looks at the background, thinks there is a shadow there, and automatically adjusts the color of the B cell to a lighter shade. And again, so here you can see how unfamiliar background makes us misjudge the color of what we see. So it thinks it's helping us, but in reality, it's actually tricking us. Same thing here. So if you look at the center block or cell on the top surface face of the cube, and the center cell or block or piece on the face that faces you. So this one here on the top and this one here at the front. So the one on the top probably looks brown to you, as it does to most people. The one here on the vertical face looks probably yellow to you. But again, if I cut them out, yep, you see, they are actually the same color. And again, so our brain, in its attempt to help us, takes a shortcut and so tries to fill the gap and tries to give us information that actually is not there. And again, if the environment, if the background was fine, what we're used to, it would have been very useful. But in this situation, it actually tricks us and leads to a misinterpretation of, in this case, color. So here is another one. So again, you probably have seen this one before. So here, what is the direction of the of the purple lines? And again, you probably know that they are parallel, but admit that they look a little bent to you, right? So if I remove the background, so you see that they are basically parallel, right? But once I add that strange background back, you see that the lines they look basically curved. And so again, here the brain misjudges the direction because it's trying to use the additional background information to judge about what it sees. And so it actually makes things worse. Now, here is another one where the brain misjudges the direction. So in this case, again, it looks like we see some sort of a zigzag on the map. But again, if I remove the background, you will see that these are perfectly parallel straight lines. But, the brain is trying to help us here and actually makes things worse. And so, as you can see, the part where I removed the background, you see that the lines are perfectly straight. But the parts where the background stays, it looks like they're trying to zigzag a little bit. So that's how it works. So the brain makes you misjudge the direction as it's trying to use the kind of context to interpret the world. Here's another one. So if I ask you what shape these tables are, you will probably say that the green one is rectangular and the red one is square. But they technically are precisely the same shape. So the blue line here, as you can see, the blue line on the picture, you can literally take a ruler and try. They are precisely the same length. And the same thing is with the yellow line. So, but it does look to us like rectangular and square just because that's how the brain is trying to interpret the depth. So it's basically giving you information that is not there. Same thing here. So when we talk about the shape, so it looks like we're looking at some sort of spirals, but let me add here the circles, and as you see, these are perfect consecutive circles. So, but if I remove them, all of a sudden you see spirals again. So the brain is misjudging color, shape, size, in this case direction, and it doesn't work. And so when I teach this course face-to-face, I would also show my students this picture here, and I would ask, which of the two lines is shorter? And again, the students look at the lines, and they see that line B is shorter. But now I've conditioned them that it's all trick questions, and they say, they must be the same? I've seen something like this, probably they're the same. But in this case, no, actually I made them different. But again, your brain sort of, thought, well, he tricked me like 5 times in a row. So this time it must be then, it's another trick. Whereas in reality, the lines are actually different. So just a little trick. Now let me show you another video here that shows how our brain misinterprets the sound. So you will see a short video that shows how, depending on what our eyes see, that's what we hear. So literally how our brain misinterprets the sound because our eyes tell it something else. So let's watch it. So let's go to the video here.
Many of us have become quick to catch illusions that trick our eyes, but how often do you consider illusions of the ear? Are you really able to trust your ears and the things they hear? For example, listen to Greg speaking.
Bar, 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 bar.
What do you hear? If you heard bar, 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 you'd be right. But how about now?
Bar, 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 bar.
Chances are you heard far, far, far this time with an F, except you didn't. In fact, the audio didn't even change between the two videos.
Bar, bar, bar.
Strange as it may seem, what you hear depends on which video you're looking at. Go ahead, take turns watching each video and see how the sound morphs.
Bar, bar, bar.
This is a perfect example of something called the McGurk effect, which shows how our visuals can alter what we believe we're hearing.
So I encourage you to watch the rest of the video at ASAP Science, a wonderful science channel. But here, if you don't believe me, again, scroll back and watch and listen to that sound, but look at one video versus the other. So you have both of them on the same screen. And depending on which one you're looking at, you will hear either bar or far. And so this is strange, tricky, but yes, that's how our brain works. So it's trying to help us, but in the process, sometimes it tricks us. And so as long as we are in the familiar environment, the context is known and familiar to us, our own culture, this actually helps a lot. So it allows us to interpret the world with less energy, with more ease, faster, more efficiently, more accurately. But if the cultures cross, if you go to a different cultural context, all of a sudden the same sounds, the same clothing, the same behaviors mean something different and you don't know it, and it creates a problem. Or vice versa. The types of cues they pay attention to, the types of gestures, the types of intonation, the types of, context, dress codes, rituals, they pay attention to different things. You don't know that. So you still keep paying attention, for example, to words instead of gestures. And so you miss important stuff. You misinterpret some stuff. And so that leads to all kinds of problems. Here is an interesting illustration of how different communication styles could be classified based on the cultural sort of background. So this triangle here shows the three different communication styles, so-called linear active, multi-active, and reactive, and how these styles sort of map out across different countries. So, for example, in the United States, in Europe, sort of Western cultures, we tend to use this linear active communication style. It tends to be more direct. The words are the foundation, so we pay attention primarily to the words. We interpret what's being said based on the words. So we are more sort of cold, fact-based, more data-driven, which is, just a style. But you go, for example, to multi-active communication style. And so that one is prevalent in Southern Europe, maybe Latin America, Africa. And you will see a style that is much more emotional, warm, expressive. So nonverbal communication becomes more common in this style. People, use emotions, gestures, context, to send messages. The words themselves may be not as important as some other sort of forms of communication. And then finally, reactive communication style, typical of Asia. So here the emphasis is on being courteous, accommodating, listening. So here interruptions are less common. People tend to be a little bit more sort of, cognizant of the feelings of other people, and so try to be nice and polite and sort of courteous to one another. So fewer interruptions, maybe slower speech pace. So things like that. Again, here it's more schematic. It doesn't mean that the countries are precisely where they are on this map, but you can see some of these differences, if you wanted to study them more academic. And then some research also shows that when it comes to communication, so interaction is quite difficult for people who come from communication or countries characterized by communication style that is linear active versus multi-active. Interaction between multi-active and reactive communication styles is possible, it just takes more time. And communication, for example, between linear active and reactive tends to be quite satisfactory. Yes, somewhat problematic, but satisfactory. Now, here is another illustration. You don't need to remember these things for an exam if you are my student, but another sort of schematic illustration of how communication styles might differ from country to country. This one by Harry Triandis, and so he also describes the sort of what he calls English communication style, sort of Western style, as more direct. So people sort of rely on words, and the message is being delivered through the words. But then, for example, if you look at the Semitic, it's a little bit, a little word and then kind of, back and forth, back and forth. Oriental is kind of beating around the bush. So when you go to Asia, indeed, in many Asian cultures, it's considered inappropriate, unpolite to, for example, say no, or to put a person in a situation where the person would lose face, as they say it. So they would not directly communicate a bad news or a negative message to you with words, but rather they would communicate it through context. So in fact, in these cultures, context matters a lot. So another study that looked at this line of research, Edward Hall, he talked about so-called low context cultures and high context cultures. So in Western cultures, low context cultures, context doesn't matter. So words matter. So we say what we mean, and that's how we deliver the message. It doesn't mean that everybody says what's on their mind. It means that when you want to communicate something, you communicate that with words. Whatever you want to communicate, you use words to express it. Whereas in some other cultures, notably in Asian cultures, the context, high context cultures, the context is often the medium of the message. So the tone may matter more. The time of the day when the meeting takes place, who is present, where you were seated at the table. So all of those things can communicate the real message. So nobody will tell you no directly, but by these sort of subtle cues, the actual message may be transmitted to you. Now, sometimes and often, in fact, when it comes to communication, you have verbal communication, and we think that it's only words. But the truth is, when it comes to words, it's still different from culture to culture. I mean, one, obviously, languages, right? So some people speak English, some people speak German, some people speak Japanese, and these are different languages. So obviously that creates a lot of confusion if you don't speak each other's language. But so languages are relatively easy to deal with because you know that the languages are different. So you study the language, you expect it to be difficult, you learn, and then eventually you are able to communicate. But then there are some language-related or verbal-related communication patterns that are still different that may lead to cross-cultural miscommunication, such as, for example, speech pace. So in some cultures, people speak faster. In others, people speak slower. But it's not only the general speed of the speech, but how the pace of the speech is interpreted. So in Western cultures, and in particular, for example, in Southern European or Latin American cultures, the studies show that people who speak fast on the topic tend to be attributed more expertise. So those who can quickly talk about the topic, they're seen as smart, credible, knowledgeable about the topic. They speak so fast, they must know everything and anything there is to know about the topic. In fact, I noticed that especially lately, we see that pattern in the Silicon Valley. Like Mark Zuckerberg tends to speak pretty fast. So there are many people now who speak fast, and we see that as, they're smart. So we recognize that as a sign of knowledge and intellect. In other cultures, in particular some Asian cultures, that the slower pace is attributed or considered indicative of more expertise, knowledge, and apparently the logic is, well, if the person speaks, so relaxed, so confidently about, when the person looks so relaxed and slow in his speech, it must signal perfect confidence and familiarity with the topic. And so that signals credibility, not the fast but slow speech. And again, sometimes that can lead to some misinterpretations of the message or the person's knowledge of the topic. Now, interruption rate changes from culture to culture. In some cultures, it's perfectly fine when multiple people speak at the same time. In other cultures, it's a big no-no. And so again, research have shown that often the language structure determines or shapes how often we interrupt one another. For example, research has shown that in languages where the important stuff goes at the beginning of the sentence, people tend to interrupt much more. In fact, for example, in English, we tend to have subject and then verb. So the most important parts of the sentence, like for example, I went to school. So who went to school? I did. What did I do? I went. And then you have to school, and then you have all those. Yesterday at 5 a.m., slowly, whatever those prepositions. So I went to school is the important stuff, and then I went to school yesterday, slowly, at 5 p.m. So those things come at the end. And so because you can get the main message of the sentence right away, you can afford to interrupt other people because you get it, you understand what they said. In other languages, and this is, by the way, a European language, but it also applies to some other languages outside of Europe, often important stuff goes at the end. Like, for example, that same sentence in German would be, and pardon my German, but it would be something like, Ich bin And then all those little details. Yesterday, Gaston slowly, I forget what is it, schnell, or I forgot what is slow, langsam, I guess, right? And only at the end you say gegangen, so I went. So you basically say the verb, that the subject comes first, but then all those details, and only at the end you have all of the verbs. Sometimes it would be actually several verbs, like, gegangen, wurden, whatever that might be. And so you have to listen until the end of the sentence to get the punchline, so to speak, because otherwise you wouldn't know what actually happened. And so the interruption rate gets a little bit lower in those kinds of languages. Also, sometimes we would think that languages that are similar would be easier to operate with or in. But the studies show that sometimes there are more communication challenges among the people who speak similar languages than among the people who come from completely different language groups. Like sometimes you would have words that are spelled and sound similarly or even identically, but they mean different things, and that creates confusion. Like, for example, mist. In English, mist means like fog, haze, something in the air. But in German, mist means manure, basically shit, and used that same way. I guess here the meaning is too different to be confused, so the meaning is, by the context you will understand that they mean different things. But for example, the word actually, so in English, actually means in reality. Actually, this is what happened. In French, actually, I think it's slightly differently spelled and pronounced, but it means presently, at this very time. And so that's where you can have some, contextually, it's not easy to spot that difference. And that's where you may have some misunderstanding, some challenge, with interpretation. And so let me show you another video, again, sort of a funny video, but one that shows how similar languages can actually be quite problematic, a matter of life and death in this case.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Again, this is sort of a funny video,
Das hier.
but yes, sometimes, those things are problematic. And again, this is a joke. Obviously, it wouldn't happen in real life, but here is what can happen in real life. So, for example, British versus American English, similar language. I mean, one language, I guess, different accents or different dialects. But here you can have some interesting things going on. Like, for example, if I told you I live in a block of flats, right? So you probably would guess that it means I live in an apartment building, but for Americans that would sound a little funny. But for example, one thing that drives me crazy is that the numbers are different. So here, for example, in the United States, 9 zeros, that's what we call a billion. But in Europe, in English particularly, or in British English, a billion has 12 zeros. And so now 9 zeros, they call it a milliard. And so you have literally, like if you're an accountant, you can literally be 1,000 times wrong if you use the names of some of the numbers. Here you have a few more examples of how some of the words have a different meaning in British versus American English. But I would like to take you to this illustration. So numbers. Again, billions, milliards, trillions, those are, large numbers that we usually don't operate with. But here is an example of numbers that we use every day and that are actually written differently. So my very first test, I came to Texas, it's been like 20-something years ago, University of Texas at Dallas, where I did my master's. And at that time, we still had the exams in blue books, by hand. You write the answers. And so I had an exam, and I lost points because the professor misinterpreted my perfectly normal European numbers. So let me show you how they're different. So if I showed you a number like this on the right, most Americans would think that it's a 7, right? Although in Europe, it's a 1, because the European 1, so American 1 is just a stick, and a 1 with this like additional stick. In the United States, it would be 7. But in Europe, that's just 1. So European 7 looks like this. So European or Asian, for that matter, 7, it has this extra crossed out thing. So whereas the American 7, it looks more like a European 1. And so 1 and 7, Europe versus the United States, they're different. Again, when I do it face to face, I would actually write on whiteboard, and maybe that's what I should do. I'm not sure if it will be clear enough. But so here is another one. So American 4 looks like this. European and Asian 4 looks like this. And so the European and Asian 4 looks more like 6 to Americans. So in Europe, 6 has this extra hook on top, whereas the American 6 doesn't have that hook. Oh, sorry, doesn't have that hook, right? Now, again, if I draw a picture like this, here on the right, most Americans will say that it's the letter G, because American 9 doesn't have that hook. But that's just how we write it. So in American English or American number system, 9 has just this straight line down, whereas the European 9 has the hook at the bottom. And so that creates sometimes confusion. So take a look here. By the way, I'm not sure if you know where the different numbers come from. So let me see if I can show that on the whiteboard so that you can, let's see if it will work. So the numbers, actually, we call them Arabic numbers. And so 1 used to be like the European 1, like this, because it has 1 angle. If you see it, let me use the blacks, it's more visible. So 1 has 1 angle, right? 2 was like this. It has 2 angles, 1 and 2, right? 3 was like this. So it has 3 angles, 1, 2, 3. 4 was like this. It has 1, 2, 3, 4 angles, right? 5 like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? 6 is like this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now European 7 has that cross because that's what gives you 7 angles. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right? 8 has 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Finally, 9 looks like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And 0 was just a round circle because circles have no angles. And because of that, circles are basically 0 angles. That's the number 0. So that's where those numbers came from. So not quite cross-cultural stuff, but that's, I guess, Europeans stuck to the Arabic original numbers a little closer than Americans, at least on some of the occasions. All right. Now, so let's talk a little bit more about when we talk about studies. So one other important difference is that nonverbal communication is also different. So for example, let me share the screen here. So nodding in most cultures means yes, right? And shaking your head in most cultures means no, but not everywhere. So for example, in Bulgaria and in Albania, it's the opposite. And you go to Bulgaria and they say yes and no. And so for most of you, if you're not Bulgarian or Albanian, it literally hurts to say no while nodding your head and say yes while shaking your head. But that's how it works. And so again, sometimes it could be a cause for misinterpretation. Now, so when we speak in a foreign language, all of these are sort of easy to deal with. But here is, let's get serious for a second. Where it really matters, especially in the workplace context, is that when people speak in a foreign language, they tend to make frequent mistakes dramatically. They tend to use simpler language, simpler vocabulary. They have a more difficult time to be engaging. They have a tendency to over-explain. And so who speaks like that? Usually that would be maybe children, maybe not very smart people. And so the challenge becomes when you work in a cross-cultural team, in a cross-cultural workplace, the challenge becomes that foreigners look not very bright to you because they make mistakes, they speak in a simple language, then they don't use colorful, engaging language. And so obviously that often might be misinterpreted as a lack of intellect, capabilities, aptitude for the task, which could be a problem. And again, it could be in the context of a rich versus poor country, which many of us are familiar with, but it could be the other way around. For example, one of my first jobs in Ukraine was to work for a company that specialized in agricultural machinery and stuff, but my immediate boss was a guy from the United Kingdom. And so he didn't really attempt to speak Ukrainian much, but he was trying sometimes. And that looked funny. And most people didn't understand him. So even though he came from a more developed country, at least at that time, many people sort of, thought that he was not particularly I don't want to say bright, but cannot be trusted with important tasks or some of the tasks because, he can't even put two words together. So that often leads to a challenge. Another related issue here is that the country image often is generalized to people's image. In fact, I actually published a couple of studies in this area where we looked at how your country image affects your peer evaluations. And we found that people who come from more prestigious countries tend to get higher peer evaluations than people who come from, let's call it, less prestigious countries after we control for the actual performance. So we know the objective performance. We know how smart people are. They literally took like all kinds of cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, IQ tests. So we know their real level. And so we know that when you ask your team members to evaluate your capabilities and abilities and performance and everything, friendliness even, we found that people who come from, let's call it, cool countries like Canada, they tend to enjoy higher peer evaluations beyond what they deserve based on their actual performance. And the other way around, people who come from so-called developing countries, less prestigious countries, tend to be sort of punished or points are taken off below their actual performance, apparently for that country image. So the socioeconomic status of your country, and particularly its prestige, tends to sort of rub onto you. And if you come from a prestigious country, you will enjoy additional positive sort of attitude towards you from others, and the other way around, which could be a problem, which could be, which could lead to the situation where the person who is given the important task, may not be the most suitable person for the task, but the one who just happens to be from a more prestigious country, or the other way around. So you may be very qualified to complete the task, but because you come from a less prestigious country, as a result, you might be sort of, in a way, discriminated against. And so that's a problem. Again, here I'm not talking about the touchy-feely stuff in terms of what is right, what is wrong, what's ethical, what's unethical. I'm talking about organizational bottom line. It is a business course, right? So it's not a course on social justice. It is a business course. And that's the problem. So sometimes people or organizations, managers, may suboptimally allocate people to tasks because of these misinterpretations. And your best guy may be best, for the job, the best for the job, but you didn't recognize it because you have those stereotypes in your head, and that would be, essentially a loss for the organization. Not to mention that it could be also unethical, immoral, and things. Emotions in the workplace. That's another interesting line of research that has been conducted. So many studies have shown that the display of emotions, and here I'm not talking about sort of crying in the workplace, but rather your personal issues, your emotional issues, how appropriate or inappropriate they are in different cultures. So in the West, usually the sentiment is that it's all business. don't take it personally. If I criticize you, that's because I want the task to be completed correctly. Whereas in some other cultures, usually, like for example in Asia, they try to sort of avoid situations where somebody would be openly criticized, and at the same time, sort of showing your affection to the company or other people can be more acceptable. Or in Latin American cultures, so showing affection to whatever it might be is more acceptable. Such as, for example, in some of these studies, study participants would be shown photographs of a working desk, and so different desks. And there would be a different number of sort of personal items on those workstations, such as your family photo, such as maybe your trophy from the last fishing trip, things like that. And so the studies show that, for example, in the United States, some personal sort of affectionate, emotional connection type of items are acceptable. Up to 20%, it's even cute and nice. But if it's more than about 20%, many Americans would judge that person as less capable, as less proficient, credible, less suitable for the sort of important tasks in the workplace. Whereas the threshold for people from Latin America was much higher, 40, 50, even more percent, meaning that they would be much more accepting of this sort of affectionate or display of emotional sort of attachments in the workplace. Likewise, studies often would do something like this. They would, for example, show a video of a conflict, like a fight in the workplace, verbal argument, and ask, so what did you see? And they noticed that, for example, Americans would often describe what's going on there in the context, sort of with more task-related categories. So apparently, a subordinate didn't do the work well. The manager was disappointed at the subordinate's performance, and so the manager was explaining to the subordinate that the work needs to be done well the next time. Whereas people from cultures where emotions play a greater role would often describe that same scene as one person is scared, the other one is angry, more like describing it not from the task-related, but from the emotional-related sort of situation. So that's a different way to look at it. Now, we can talk about it all day long, so I want to talk a little bit just more about what is culture, how it's measured, including some of my own work. So first here, let me show you, here is a sort of a page or some of the screenshots from a publication by William Darton from 1790. So that's more than 200 years ago. The publication was called Inhabitants of the World. And here, as you can see, he was trying to describe the culture of the Dutchman, Englishman, Frenchman, and Norwegian. I'm not sure if these descriptions are still accurate. They probably are not, or maybe they are. I mean, read and you decide for yourself if you're familiar with those cultures. But the point is that even 250 years ago or 40 years ago, people recognized that cultures are different. They tried to study them, they tried to describe them so that we can use it in everyday life. And so here, if I ask you what is culture, right? So if I ask you what is culture, would you be able to define it? There was a study not long ago that collected, I think, 64 definitions of culture. And so in some of my own work on culture, I would literally devote a couple of pages just to the definitions of what culture is. Well, before I get into that definitions, I'll tell you this. Culture is an extremely pervasive word. If you type culture in Google, you get literally billions of hits. And I notice the number of hits differs depending on, when you do it and how you do it. But you'll get literally billions of hits, billions of websites with the word culture in them. And what's interesting, at least when I tried it the last time, culture gave me more hits than sex, money. I think I also tried things like politics and, some other popular search terms. So it's an extremely pervasive word, extremely pervasive. So what is culture? Well, some people describe culture as an onion. Notably, the father, I guess we could call him that way, of the cross-cultural management field, Gert Hofstede, so the famous Dutch scholar who died a couple of years ago, unfortunately. So, but the one who sort of pioneered the research on the effects of culture in the workplace, specifically with his 1980 book, Culture's Consequences. So he was describing culture as an onion, saying that it has layers. So some things are visible right away, such as symbols, maybe, the way you dress or the symbols that represent your culture. But you can go deeper and deeper when it comes to culture, all the way to values. So heroes, rituals, and then at the core of the culture are values. And so he tried to develop a way to measure cultural values, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, but that was his sort of map or view or symbol of culture. Others talk about culture as an iceberg. And so they say that some elements of culture are visible right away. So you come to a new country and you see right away that people dress differently, they speak different languages, they have different protocols, traditions, rituals. And so those are the visible attributes of cultures. So that's what you see right away. But culture is much more than that. So culture is much bigger when it comes to the invisible things. And that includes values, attitudes, assumptions. So those are hard to see. And to be honest, sometimes, I've seen people who would spend decades in the country and still don't see some of those, underwater types of, elements of culture. In fact, I've been in the United States, between the United States and Canada for a quarter century now. And there are many things about American culture that it's not that I don't see it, it's more like I don't get it. Like, for example, I still coming out, sorry, don't judge me too harshly. I don't get, for example, baseball. I don't get American football. Like, for example, Thanksgiving, my neighbors get together for the Thanksgiving football, Super Bowl. I don't get it. I mean, it's like 5 seconds of action, 20 minutes of commercial. I still don't quite understand the rules, even though, I understand the main purpose of the game, but like soccer, no, that I understand. Hockey, basketball, European sort of sports. I'm not sure if you can call basketball European. I guess it came from Canada. But those I know and understand. American football, I don't quite get it. So again, nothing wrong with that. But, just the point is that sometimes you have to grow up with these things to get them, so to speak. Whereas I was never exposed to American football and I just don't get it. Now, my personal favorite metaphor for culture is a vegetable. Sort of not so much as an iceberg, but as a vegetable. You can recognize the vegetable by its foliage, by its leaves. Like you see the leaves that like the ones on the picture here, immediately that's probably a carrot. But unless you dig it up, so to speak, go deeper and you actually taste it, you would never know what carrot is like. So same thing here. So you can recognize when a person is from, for example, Japan or Saudi Arabia or from the United States by the look, by the leaves, by the foliage. But unless you immerse yourself in that culture for an extended period of time, unless you live there for a while, unless you taste it, you will never know what that culture is like. And so that's something that seems to me is more sort of representative of what culture is. Now, here is a question for you. How would you measure culture? Lord Kelvin famously said that if you can express something with numbers, if you can describe something with numbers, you are getting somewhere. Your knowledge of the subject becomes more concrete. But if you cannot describe something with numbers, your knowledge of the subject is of superficial nature. So you're only getting a beginning of understanding, but you cannot really understand it unless you can measure it, so to speak. And so the question I have for you is, how would you measure culture? So hundreds and hundreds, by now probably thousands of studies on culture, but how do they measure them? Science is basically numbers, math. How would you measure it? So let me tell you how it's been measured in cross-cultural management and other disciplines, and I'll also tell you why this is not a perfect method. And so this is the best we can do so far, but it's not perfect. Gerd Hofstede, whom I mentioned some time ago, so he was the one who sort of not really pioneered this method, so some of that work was done by others, like Lodge Horn, for example, but Hofstede was the one who popularized this method. And so the way he measured culture was there was a set of questions, that would ask people about different things, different sort of attitudes, behaviors, preferences. So Hofstadter would ask questions such as, how important it is for you to live close to your family? Or would you agree with the statement that managers should consult their subordinates when making decisions? Things like that. And so they would have a sample of people from different cultures. So in Hofstadter's original study, he had, I believe it was 41 or 42 countries. And so there would be a few hundred people from each country, and they would all be asked the same questions. And then by looking at the answers to those questions, by averaging those answers, a picture started emerging for how those answers are different by culture. So, for example, in some Asian cultures, more people would say that it's important for them to live close to their families, whereas more people in the West said that it doesn't really matter to them, things like that. On the contrary, people in the West tended to say more that managers should consult their subordinates when making decisions, whereas people in Asia were more, no, managers should make their decisions on their own. And so that gives you some sort of an understanding of how these differences are different. And so those questions would be asked not open-endedly, but there would be like what we call a Likert type scale, where you have on a scale from 1 to 7, how important it is for you. And so you would indicate your responses, then they're averaged to you, then to the country, then you compare the averages, and that's what basically you get as the national averages. And so in these studies, Hofstadter derived or first described 4 main cultural dimensions. So individualism, collectivism. So for example, the West is individualist and the East tends to be collectivist. Power distance. So for example, Northern European countries tend to be low power distance. A manager is just a manager, not necessarily somebody super special. Whereas Asia is high power distance. So there is a huge difference between the boss and the subordinate. Uncertainty avoidance is another dimension, and there was also masculinity, femininity. So basically assertiveness versus harmony seeking. Hofstadter later added other dimensions to his model, long short-term orientation, and then pleasure-seeking, hedonism, so several others were added. And many other models have been developed for culture. In fact, one of them is my own. So I recently actually published a paper that I've been working on for years, where I developed my own sort of list of dimensions of culture and developed an instrument for measuring those cultural values. And in fact, with my colleagues here, we showed that our instrument is better than all of the other instruments available out there. And in my own collection, in fact, I published once a study that talked about how culture has been measured. And so for that one, I found 150 instruments for measuring culture. And so I described the methodology and differences and pros and cons. And because many of them were not very good, I decided to develop my own, which I did. So just adding perhaps even more confusion to the field, as if we needed one extra instrument for measuring cultural values. But here are some of the dimensions of culture that I would like to describe. So dimensions of culture that have been frequently discussed in literature. So one, as I said, individualism, collectivism. So essentially it's about my own interests versus the group's interests. So my interests are important in individualistic cultures. Task is more important than relationship. Neighbors, classmates, co-workers are just people I know. So it's not that critical. Whereas in collectivist cultures, it's more about, relationships and, people who are close to me, like my relatives or my friends. They matter more than the task. I would make basically, work extra hard to keep them happy. And so probably not surprisingly for you, when you look at how cultures have been sort of ranked on individualism, collectivism, the United States tends to be ranked the highest. In Hofstadter's original version, on a 100-point scale, the United States scored 91 on individualism, being the most individualistic country on the planet. I'm not sure if it's still the case, but it's definitely on the top of the list. Whereas when you get countries like, for example, China, India, Latin America, They tend to be more collectivist. But even within those cultures, there have been a lot of studies that looked at within country differences. And you would see often that, for example, rural China is more collectivist than urban China. And urban Indian cities are getting more and more westernized, more and more individualist. Not quite where, for example, Americans are, but still there would be some differences. And in a way, in fact, in one of my studies, I showed with my colleagues that within country differences could be very dramatic, big, and sometimes it may be more appropriate to talk about, for example, cultures of professions than cultures of nations, because lawyers and, for example, entrepreneurs or businessmen in the United States are actually not that different from entrepreneurs and lawyers, for example, in India or China, but they're very different from, for example, farmers in the United States. So there may be more difference between an American lawyer from Manhattan and an American farmer from Idaho than between an American lawyer from Manhattan and a Chinese lawyer from Shanghai. So, but anyway, that's one of the dimensions. So what would be the lessons here when you deal with people from individualist versus collectivist cultures? Well, when you work with, for example, Americans who tend to be individualist, expect them to be more focused on the task. So expect them to put work first, relationship second. So not completing a task on time, if you have a manager from the United States, will make him probably or her unhappy. And even though you may be friends, you probably will have to sort of answer for that. You may be reprehended for that. So favors for relatives may be perceived as nepotism or corruption. So, and don't afraid to show your individuality through clothing, through initiative. It's okay to maybe, disagree sometimes and show your personal preferences and things like that. So whereas when you work with people, for example, from Asia or Latin America, so it may be a good idea to always ask them about their family, friends, their family members' health and things like that, progress at school of their children, so they would appreciate it. So to them, it matters a lot. Expect them to prefer to work with people they trust, such as relatives, maybe friends. When it comes to hiring, for example, it's not corruption, it's not nepotism, it's more collectivism, right? So invite them to your home. They will appreciate that very much. So I know in the United States it's very uncommon, whereas in collectivist cultures, people would often invite guests to their homes, even, after a very short while. Another dimension is, and that's not from Hofstadter, that's from Trompenaars. Fons Trompenaars, another Dutch scientist and consultant. So that's so-called status attribution. So who has more status? Well, in some cultures, like for example in the West, the status is attributed by achievement. So your origin is not really that important. Your family is not really that important. The fact that you're a child of a rich person is not critically important. It's what you can do, your IQ, your performance. That's what matters in the workplace. I mean, obviously, especially in the United States, for example, there is a difference between a child of a millionaire versus a child from the poor neighborhood. There is definitely institutional differences, no doubt about that. But in the workplace, if you do the job, you can come from the poorest background and you will be treated with respect. And vice versa. If you come from a privileged background, but you don't do the work, that will not help you. So you will probably not be praised too much. Whereas in other cultures, notably, for example, Middle East, or maybe Southern Europe, or maybe even sometimes Northern Europe, like in the United Kingdom, your roots, your connections are the sort of attribute by which your status is attributed. So your origin to family, your sort of aristocratic background maybe matters a lot more than, for example, in the United States. The kind of family you come from matters a lot. In Asia, the fact that you're older may matter a lot. So whereas in the United States, I guess we try to respect older people, but when it comes to the workplace, not necessarily you will see that. So when it comes to the rankings, here is where we stand. So in the United States, merit is usually used to attribute status. But if you go to, for example, Middle East, your origin, your connections often make a bigger, role. And so it's not hard to think about the lessons So when you work with Americans, don't expect any special treatment just because you're older or you come from a great family or you have had achievements in your previous work and things like that. And if you're older and they're younger, it may seem to you disrespectful that they don't listen to you, but that's how they are. So it's more about merit rather than your age. And then in Asian or Middle Eastern countries, it's the opposite, right? Now, let me give you an illustrative example before I talk about the next dimension of culture. And so this one goes like this. Again, it's from Von Strompenaars. So imagine that you're riding in a car driven by your father. And so your father is at the steering wheel and he hits a pedestrian. So the lawyer comes and says that, so you know that your father was going at least 80 miles per hour in an area of the city where the maximum allowed speed is 60 miles per hour. There are no witnesses, and your lawyer says that if you are willing to testify that your father was driving under the speed limit, it will save your father from a lot of trouble. So the question is, would you lie? You know that your father was breaking the speed limit. Would you lie to save your father? And so the answer here depends very much on culture. I've done it many times and with my own students. And I noticed that people, for example, from Asia or from Latin America, they're much, much more willing to lie, essentially in this case, to save a relative, in this case, the father. And Americans are much less likely to lie. What's interesting, too, is that when you make the conditions more severe, so when you say, what if the pedestrian dies, then even more Asians, for example, or Latin Americans, people from those cultures, collectivist cultures, tend to say, okay, well, now it's getting really serious. So now I really have to lie to save my father. Whereas in the United States, it's the opposite, actually. So when you make the conditions more serious, then fewer people, even fewer people are willing to lie. They say, okay, well, now it's serious. I may have been willing to take to lie to, help my father before, but if the pedestrian dies, that's actually a problem. And so now I'm not going to lie. And so that's the dimension that Trompenaars calls universalism, particularism. So basically, are you willing to apply the rules universally, regardless of your relationships? Or are you applying the rules with exceptions for your relatives or other circumstances? And so when you look at the map of the world, so the United States and Canada are the most universalist cultures. And again, this is not the full list, but just to give you a couple of examples. So regardless of our relationships, the rules are the rules, and I will apply them consistently. Whereas, for example, again, I've been comparing sort of West-East. In Asia, in China in particularly, people tend to be much more particularist. So they are much more willing to make exceptions. In fact, they expect you to make exceptions if we are friends, if we are relatives, because, that's a particularist culture. So collectivism is, I guess, a related dimension. So the lessons would be, yes, if you work with Americans, don't expect favors at work just because you're friends or because you have special circumstances. And likewise, you will not be softer, or you would not be expected to be softer on your friends when there is a problem. And in Asia, Middle East, Latin America, it's the opposite, right? Let's do one more just as an illustration. And so this one again starts with an illustrative example. So your boss or your professor asks you to help him paint his house this weekend. Should you help him or should you not? Again, when I ask this question of my American students, most of them say, no, that would be, first of all, weird to ask. And second, I would not feel obliged to help in any way. Maybe I will use it as a way to build some, rapport and relationships to advance my career. But I don't feel obliged to do it just because he's my boss. Whereas in Asia, it's the opposite. Of course, yeah. I mean, if the manager asks you, I should help. And again, so that leads us to what some scholars call power distance, right? So the distance between the managers and the subordinates. So in high power distance cultures, notably Confucian cultures, so the boss is the ruler. So the boss has authority, almost like semi-god. So the boss always knows what to do. If you notice that the boss doesn't know what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, you never show that. You respect and you never show such a disrespect to your manager. And so managers often are expected to be decisive, tough, and are basically ruling. In low power distance cultures, like for example, Northern Europe, these are much more egalitarian societies. So display of power difference is not welcome. Offices of managers tend to be similar to offices of subordinates, often identical. No separate cafeterias for managers, no separate arrangements, maybe when it comes to transportation and things like that. So much more egalitarian. And so it's common to call your boss by the first name. And everybody sort of understands that your boss is just a person who happens to hold the position, but it doesn't make your boss, this revered person, whom you should always unconditionally respect. And so managers often would be expected to consult subordinates when they make decisions. And so here is a map of what it looks like when it comes to the world distribution. Again, I'm using only a few countries, no point in going through the entire list of countries for this course, but yes. So Asia tends to be more power distance oriented, whereas power distance tends to be lower in the United States, for example, and Canada. What's interesting in the United States here is, in a way, unique, is that when you ask Americans about the preferred leadership style, the answers will depend largely on whom you are asking about. So if you ask Americans what kind of boss you want to have, most Americans would like to be egalitarian. So they want to have a boss who will consult you, who will work with you and hold you as an equal. But when you are asking Americans what kind of boss you want to be, most Americans become high power distance. And so they would like the differential. They would like to be treated with sort of special treatment, extra respect, maybe have a special cafeteria and a bigger business car. So as a result, so here for the United States, which is kind of unique because for most other countries, the difference between what kind of boss you want to be versus what kind of boss you want to have is not that different. Whereas for the United States, it is. And so the implications here are obvious. So when you work with an American boss, you would be expected to provide input, voice your opinions, suggestions, maybe even sometimes challenge the decisions. And then, rituals will be minimal. You will shake hands with your boss. You will not bow to your boss. You will often call them by the first name and so on. Whereas if you have an Asian supervisor, you will be expected to be much more differential. You would be much more, respectful, never challenge the manager or professor and things like that. So it definitely makes a huge difference. And when working, supervising people from different cultures, again, if you have supervisees, subordinates from high power distance cultures, know that they may be uncomfortable challenging you. They may be uncomfortable sharing their views and preferences. And so you have to proactively seek those out because otherwise you will never hear from them. And vice versa, if you are from a high power distance culture, but you have, let's say, for example, subordinates from low power distance culture, again, when they seem to show not enough respect to you, it's not because they don't respect you. It's not because they don't like you. It's just different culture. And so that's, something that you need to keep in mind. One more, just to close it. Gender equality. Again, in some cultures, men versus women are attributed different sort of status, different professions, different roles. So in some cultures, what we call gender differentiation cultures, it is expected that men will be managers or soldiers or engineers, whereas women would be expected to be nurses or stay-at-home moms and things like that. In cultures that are gender egalitarian, these differences are much less visible. So it's common to have women in politics and business, in leadership roles. women are as expected, if not more expected, to go to college. Men are not necessarily expected to be decisive, and women are not necessarily expected to be gentle and differential. So again, in cultures, for example, that are more like Southern Europe or Middle East, that's where you see a dramatic difference in gender roles. Asia, Africa, very big difference in gender roles. You go to the West in general, but especially like Northern Europe, Canada, much less differences. So almost invisible differences in roles. Even stay-at-home moms are not very common anymore. And again, that may play a huge role in the workplace. That may be a big difference, like, for example, how women are treated in the workplace, what kind of roles they are assigned, the whole glass ceiling effect. So in cultures that are egalitarian, gender egalitarian, women can be presidents, prime ministers, can reach whatever, heights they want. Whereas in cultures where gender roles are more differentiated, women may not be, sometimes even not even allowed to hold some positions, or at least, the norms are such that they're not, it's not common to see them there. And so as a manager, again, if you happen to lead women who are, or lead in a culture where the roles are very different, you may actively welcome and encourage women to speak up, to challenge you, and the other way around. If you are from a culture where gender roles are very clearly pronounced, and you come, for example, to Norway or Canada, and women all of a sudden challenge you or behave with you as if you're equal to them, that's, first of all, it's beautiful. I welcome that in general. But more importantly, don't think that it's some form of disrespect. It's just the culture. It is culture, and that's how things work in the workplace. I'm going to stop here. There is so much more we can talk about. I mean, I wish I could go through at least my own papers and review some of those brilliant, wise contributions I've made to this field and understanding of the effects of culture in the workplace. But I mean, on a serious note, there are a lot of interesting books on this topic, and culture, as I said, matters. As my brother said, he's an engineer, electrical engineer, and so he said, yes, most of us think that it's all about sort of the hardware, which is, the hardcore performance or the laws. But the software is sort of the culture. In fact, Hofstadter called the culture the software of mind. So in a way, you can have the fastest RAM, the fastest processor, the biggest battery, the strongest screen, but if your software is not there, all of that is just a pile of metal. So all of that is not as useful. So in culture is like that. So you can have the best team with the highest IQ, with the highest skills, with the best tools, computers. But if culture is not taken into account, performance may not be optimal, may not be as high as it could be for that team. And so hopefully today's lesson gave you a little bit more appreciation for the effects of culture in the workplace. Thank you for your attention.